Chapter 27. Some critics act as if Flaubert, Milton, or Wordsworth were some tedious old aunt in a rocking chair who smelt of stale powder, was only interested in the past, and hadn't said anything new for years. Of course, it's her house and everybody's living in it rent-free, but even so, surely it is, well, you know, time? From Flaubert's Parrot by Julian Barnes, written in 1984. By the mid-1960s, Dirac was spending most of the week working at home. At the department, he looked increasingly out of place. He was irrelevant, his young colleague and former student John Polkinghorne remembers. Other Cambridge physicists thought the same, but followed the scientist's unwritten code of chivalry. When great researchers go to seed and speak out against modern trends in their subject, they should be ignored and even mocked in private, but be heartily praised in public for their past achievements. Outside the university, too, Dirac cut the lonely figure of a misfit from another age, uncomfortable with the new popular culture and its irreverence. It was unthinkable to him that serious critics could treat a painting of a soup tin as a mainstream work of art, and that many of the defining songs of a generation were written by cheeky, working-class Liverpudlians who could not read music. What Dirac wondered was he going to make of a group whose lead vocalist claimed to be a walrus. Dirac was beginning to fear old age and the prospect of being effectively abandoned by his colleagues. All the signs were that that Bachelor was going to bundle him out of his Lacasian chair at the statutory retirement age of 67. The threat led Dirac to make a brief venture into the poisonous netherworld of university politics in the spring of 1964, when he joined Hoyle and a few others to seek Bachelor's removal after his first 5-year stint as head of their department. Outmanoeuvred, they failed miserably. With no wish to be part of Bachelor's empire, and with his child-rearing responsibilities behind him, Dirac, encouraged by Mansi, resumed his travels and spent even more time in his garden, trimming his immaculate lawn, pruning his roses, and growing far more vegetables than Mansi needed for her larder. His bookshelves heaved with horticultural magazines and books, making his study look as if it belonged not to a research physicist, but to a landscape gardener. He still did research, but he knew that he had next to no chance of coming up with a radically new idea. He was enduring the fate of all aging theoretical physicists. His spirit was outliving his imagination. Though marginalised in Cambridge, he was treated kindly at his favourite academic address in the USA. In the spring of 1963, Dirac heard from Oppenheimer that he had arranged for a framed photograph of him to be mounted on a wall at the Institute for Advanced Study, next to a snapshot of Einstein. "You two are alone on that wall." This simple gesture symbolized the generosity of the American academic system, much more willing than British universities to find room for leading scholars to spend their unproductive twilight years in dignity. Mainly for this reason, Dirac spent more time in the USA. From 1962 and to his retirement in 1969, Dirac visited the United States every year for at least a couple of months, twice for almost an entire academic year, 1962 to 3, and 1964 to 5. For much of the rest of the time, he and Mansi were visiting conferences or on vacation in Europe and Israel. The USSR was no longer on their itinerary, apparently because even they could not get a visa. And during these 7 years, Stephen Hawking, a colleague of Dirac's and a rising star, did not see him in the department. Mansi had set her heart on escaping from Cambridge. Dirac disliked change and wanted to be loyal to his university, but eventually agreed that it was time to emigrate, preferably to the USA. He did not have the initiative to secure a new position. That task fell to Mansi, who assumed a new role as the pushy manager of a tongue-tied talent, chasing royalties and upgrades, insisting on sea-facing cabins and the room with the finest view. He was her Elvis, and she was his Colonel Parker. Lecturing had become Dirac's forte. Although his voice was weakening, he could be relied on to keep his audience hooked, not through wit and humour, but through clarity and humility. At the podium he looked and sounded like an elderly preacher from Bristol, but had the innocence of a young lad reading an essay on prize day, clipping his vowels, emphasizing his consonants with the force of a stab. It was often a surprise to people in the audience that such a taciturn man was so fluent, hardly ever hesitating with an or and rarely showing a sign of even approaching a grammatical tangle. His most unnerving idiosyncrasy was a propensity to go silent in mid-sentence when he needed to think or find the right words. He would suddenly stop talking, typically for 10 seconds, but sometimes for over a minute, before resuming without comment. He presented fewer specialist talks, but occasionally gave guest lectures, including a series on quantum field theory at Yeshiva University in New York in the spring of 1964. In these lectures, later recognized as classics, he developed the theory logically from its beginnings and, unusually for him, spelt out in detail the calculations that led to the prediction of the energy shift of the hydrogen atom, measured by Lamb in 1946. Although the theory and experiment agree to within experimental uncertainties, Dirac left his audience in no doubt that the theory of quantum electrodynamics is profoundly flawed. If one is a research worker, one mustn't believe in anything too strongly. One must always be prepared that various beliefs one has had for a long time may be overthrown, he said. A year earlier at Yeshiva, he gave his lecture, The Evolution of the Physicist's Picture of Nature, which he adapted into an article for the May 1963 edition of Scientific American, the only article he ever wrote for a popular science magazine. The style and content of the talk foreshadowed dozens of similar presentations. He explained in plain, stripped-down language why fundamental physics was in crisis, drawing lessons from an often simplistic overview of the history of physics. In the article, he dwelt on one of his favourite anecdotes. Schrödinger claimed that he had discovered a mathematically beautiful relativistic version of his equation a few months before the famous non-relativistic version, but did not publish the relativistic equation because it failed to account for observations on the hydrogen atom. The disagreement arose because it was not known at that time that the electron has spin. Schrödinger published his non-relativistic version only when he was sure it was in good agreement with the data, but if he had been bolder, he would have been the first to publish a relativistic quantum theory. For Dirac, this story had a moral. It is more important to have beauty in one's equations than to have them fit experiment. Dirac suggested that, quote, God is a mathematician of very high order, and he used very advanced mathematics in constructing the universe, unquote, having apparently forgotten that he first encountered the God-beauty link 40 years before in the writings of his colleague Sir James Jeans. In his positivist youth, Dirac would have regarded the link as unverifiable and therefore meaningless, but he had changed his tune. After spending decades on the terra firma of experiment-based science, he was ready to take pleasure trips on the seas of metaphysical philosophy. The physicist in Dirac now seemed to prefer the past to the present. Uncomfortable in the company of the leading young physicists, he was most at ease when he was reminiscing with his old friends. He missed none of the triennial meetings of Nobel laureates at Lindau, a relaxed town in southern Germany, where he talked with physicists and with rather more reserve to the students invited to join them. Horizon, the flagship science series of the new British television channel BBC Two, made a film at the 1965 meeting produced by Peter Loisos. He saw that the two Nobelists most lionized by the students were Dirac and Heisenberg, who attracted swarms of advisors like Hollywood stars, and that away from the melee, Dirac followed Heisenberg like a butler. Loisos knew it was not going to be easy to persuade Dirac to talk, as several BBC radio and television producers had asked him for interviews, but had been turned down firmly. But Dirac agreed to be filmed in conversation with Heisenberg, and the result is a unique recording of Dirac in relaxed conversation. Always with an agreeable smile, Heisenberg was as smartly dressed and easygoing as he had been 30 years before, but Dirac had changed rather more. His comically ill-combed hair helped to maintain his reputation for peerless dishevelment, but he was more relaxed than he had been as a young man, constantly smiling with his eyes and his mouth, speaking with a surprising assertiveness. Most striking about the encounter is that Dirac led the discussion, especially after he steered the subject towards beauty via his anecdote about Schrödinger's premature shelving of the relativistic version of his equation. When Heisenberg gently remarked that beauty is less important than agreement with experiment, the conventional view, Dirac took up the cudgels for asceticism, forcing Heisenberg onto the defensive. Heisenberg said, I do agree that the beauty of an equation is a very important point, and that one can get already a lot of confidence from the beauty of an equation. On the other hand, you have to check whether it fits or whether it doesn't. It's only physics when it really fits with nature, but that may turn out much later. Dirac. And if it doesn't fit, you'd hold up publication, would you, just like Schrödinger? Heisenberg. I'm not sure that I would. At least in one case, I have not done so. Smiling beatifically, Heisenberg appeared to concede the point. 30 years before, he would have persisted with the tenacity of a terrier, but his appetite for competition had been weakened by years of post-war humiliation. Delighted to have won the argument, Dirac's face lit up with the broadest of smiles, revealing 2 rows of rotting teeth. Dirac still had faith in the large numbers hypothesis, although he knew that most physicists regarded it as a blot on his CV after Edward Teller had published an apparently damning refutation of it in 1948. Teller pointed out that the hypothesis implied that because the universe is expanding, gravitational forces were greater millions of years ago than they are today. Teller showed that Dirac's idea implied that the Earth's oceans would have boiled and evaporated away 200 to 300 million years ago, contrary to the geological evidence that life had existed on the planet for at least 500 million years. Gosh, it's interesting. Those figures are small for the time. Interest in the hypothesis had flickered again in 1957, when the American cosmologist Robert Dicke demonstrated that the large numbers hypothesis is a consequence of the fact that human life occurs after stars were formed and before they die. If the hypothesis were wrong, astronomers and all other life forms would not exist. Dirac was unimpressed with Dicke's reasoning and would not budge. He believed in the importance of the hypothesis more than ever. In November 1961, Dirac wrote his first public comment on cosmology in 22 years. On Dicke's assumption, habitable planets could exist for only a limited period of time. With my assumption, they could exist indefinitely in the future, and life need never end. There is no decisive argument for deciding between these assumptions. I prefer the one that allows the possibility of endless life. Dirac's version of the fate of the universe was consonant with one of the articles of faith he wrote in his philosophical jottings of January 1933. The human race will continue to live forever, a subjective assumption he had to make for his own peace of mind. Evidently, this most detached of theoreticians could not bear to think of a universe without human beings. One of the few cosmologists who still believed that it was worth spending time on Dirac's hypothesis was the vodka-swilling giant George Gamow. In 1965, he took a sabbatical in Cambridge, accompanied by his new wife, Barbara, whom he had married shortly after his divorce from Roe in 1956, on mental grounds. The Gamows stayed at the New Churchill College, whose first master, Sir John Cockcroft, had been chosen by the Prime Minister, after whom it was named. One topic of discussion between Dirac and Gamow was the beauty of the steady-state theory of the universe, which says that the universe has no beginning or end, but goes on forever like a film with endlessly repeated plot. That summer, this was a topical question because the steady-state theory seemed to have been discredited by one of the most telling astronomical observations to have been made in decades. 2 astronomers at the Bell Laboratories in New Jersey had detected an all-pervading background bath of low-energy radiation. It was only after the astronomers made their observations that they heard that just such a bath of radiation had been predicted long before by Gamow and others using the Big Bang theory. For most cosmologists, the theory afforded a beautifully simple description of the development of the universe, compatible with the general theory of relativity and all the other great theories of science. Fred Hoyle, who had given the Big Bang theory its name in 1949, during one of his BBC radio broadcasts, was the most vocal of the diminishing number who did not give up on the steady-state theory. Hoyle found the idea of the Big Bang distasteful and compared the notion of the universe emerging out of nothing to a party girl jumping out of a cake. It wasn't dignified nor elegant. After one of his discussions with Dirac, Gamow wrote to ask if he had heard of a tongue-in-cheek summary of the role of aesthetics that appears to have dated from their days in Copenhagen. Gamow uses the word elegant, where Dirac would use the word beautiful. Case 1. Trivial statement. If an elegant theory agrees with experiment, there is nothing to worry about. Case 2. Heisenberg's postulate. If an elegant theory does not agree with experiment, the experiment must be wrong. Case 3. Bohr's amendment. If an inelegant theory disagrees with experiment, the case is not lost because by improving the theory one can make it agree with the experiment. Case 4. My opinion. If an inelegant theory agrees with experiment, the case is hopeless. Dirac believed that if observations agree with an ugly theory, such as quantum electrodynamics, it is little more than a coincidence. He had a fundamentalist belief in beauty, as Heisenberg found when he produced a new theory of particle physics, and pressed Dirac for specific criticism, only for Dirac to give the thumbs down to the theory because its basic equation had insufficient mathematical beauty. Kapitsa was one of the few who understood Dirac's passion for beauty, perhaps because he had helped to foster it in their early conversations in the Cavendish and in Trinity College. Dirac may have feared that he would never again feel the thrill of Kapitsa's company in Cambridge, but he heard in the spring of 1966 that both Kapitsa and his wife had secured exit visas to enable them to return for a short stay. In late April, as the Kapitsa's arrival from Russia drew near, Dirac and Mansi were like children on the eve of a royal visit, so excited that they could barely concentrate on the preparations. By 1966, Kapitsa was the Soviet Union's most famous scientist. In the address books of most of the country's leading artists and a licensed critic of the government, the British ambassador wrote in advance to Cockcroft to warn him that Kapitsa was still a bit of a rebel, and suggested that the public relations aspect of the visit will require rather careful watching. But the ambassador need not have worried. Kapitsa was on his best behaviour, having learnt from Rutherford how to balance irreverence and propriety, so that he could be seen as both close to the establishment and fiercely independent. In his interviews, he was always careful to stress that he had played no part in the development of nuclear weapons, and that he was as patriotic as ever, as he demonstrated in his lecture, The Training of the Young Scientist in the USSR, in the hall of Trinity College. When the Kapitzas visited the Diracs for lunch, Mansi made a special effort in the kitchen, poaching a salmon and serving it with homemade mayonnaise and a chilled burgundy. Mary recalled that it was the closest her parents ever came to giving a banquet. For just that one afternoon, the front room had the warmth of a jacuzzi. Their reminiscences darted around from the summer they spent in the Kapitzas' Dasha to their days in the Cavendish, with Kapitza telling wedding night jokes so blue that Anna left the room, leaving Dirac and Mansi to giggle their way to the punchline. They will also have talked about Kapitza's club, which had ceased to exist in the spring of 1958, superseded by programs of seminars. The club, however, was reconvened on the 10th of May for its 676th meeting, so that some of its surviving members, including Dirac and Cockcroft, could meet one last time, and so that Kapitza could close it. The venue was a smart common room in Gonville and Keyes College, where the participants sipped fine dessert wines, in contrast to the meetings 40 years ago, when they would drink dishwater coffee. A photograph of the occasion shows Kapitza and a forlorn-looking Dirac, his left elbow leaning on the table, his left hand supporting his head. He gives the impression of being bored out of his mind. The highlight of the meeting was a joint presentation by Dirac and Kapitza on the effect that they had identified in 1933, a year before Kapitza had been detained in the Soviet Union. The possibility that electrons could be bent or diffracted by light. When they first predicted the effect, it was impossible to observe because the available sources of light were too weak and the electron detectors were too insensitive. But now detection looked possible, following improvements to the sensitivity of the detectors and, of course, the invention of lasers, devices that had become familiar to the public since they featured in the 1964 James Bond film Goldfinger. The barrel-chested Kapitza, standing by a blackboard and easel, pointed out that it was now odds-on that experimenters would soon observe the effect. The question was, would Dirac and Kapitza be alive to see it? A few days after the Kapitzas left Cambridge, Dirac switched his attention from the past to the future. He attended an entire course of lectures on modern particle physics given by the American theoretician Murray Gell-Mann, a source of many of the most productive new ideas in particle physics since the early 1950s. Then 36, and still at the height of his powers, he was admired for his imagination and technical brilliance, but feared for his waspish tongue and disliked for his egoism, not least by Dirac. In the 1960s, Gell-Mann and others suggested strongly interacting particles could be classified in mathematical patterns, and he used one of them in 1963 to predict the existence of a new particle. When experimenters detected it in the following year, it was a signal success for theoretical physics. Gell-Mann and his colleague George Zweig, working independently, also proposed that strongly interacting particles might consist of different combinations of three varieties of a new type of fundamental particle that Gell-Mann called quarks. He took the word from James Joyce's Finnegan's Wakes, 3 quarks for Master Mark. But Gell-Mann himself was sceptical. He remarked in his lectures that quarks were probably not real particles but mathematical artifacts that helped to explain the symmetries among the properties of the strongly interacting particles. A year later, Gell-Mann recalled that he was surprised that Dirac loved quarks, despite their having, in Gell-Mann's opinion, many annoying properties, including their apparently permanent confinement inside strongly interacting particles such as protons and neutrons. When Gell-Mann asked Dirac why he thought quarks are so marvellous, Dirac replied that they have the same spin as the electron, the muon, and the neutrino. Perhaps Dirac had seen that it was possible that all fundamental constituents of matter have the same spin, the spin of the electron. And perhaps he had sensed that it might soon be possible to set out a description of strong interactions in terms of a field theory as he had hoped. Gell-Mann's lectures taught Dirac a lesson, the bottom-up way of doing theoretical physics, drawing inspiration from experimental observations, was proving much more productive than the top-down style taking cues from beautiful mathematics that Dirac practiced and preached. Dirac privately admitted this, though he had no intention of changing his approach. In mid-September 1967, the Diracs heard that Sir John Cockcroft, one of their closest friends, had died suddenly of a heart attack in the Master's Lodge of Churchill College. Several of his friends believed that his death had been hastened by his anxiety over a classic Cold War melodrama that had taken place 2 days before. Soviet embassy officials abducted his colleague, Vladimir Chachenko, a student prodigy of Kapitsa, on the Bayswater Road in London, and had whisked him off to Heathrow, where they put him on a plane bound for Moscow. But just as his plane was setting off, it was surrounded by squad cars of airport police and MI5 agents, who boarded the plane and found him looking sick and bleary-eyed, apparently under sedation. They forcibly removed him, outraging the Soviet authorities, who protested that he was leaving Britain of his own volition, having been blackmailed and intimidated by British agents. Cockcroft died on the morning after the incident became public, when the story was on the front page of the Times. His wife Elizabeth knew that she would soon have to leave the lodge to make way for the next master, and the college assisted her in making the move. In the opinion of the Cockcroft's children, the authorities treated her sensitively and with a good deal of generosity, but Mansi disagreed. She told everyone who would listen that the college was shooting Lady Cockcroft out of the lodge with despicable haste. Mansi's patience with Cambridge finally ran out, and she made up her mind that Dirac must move to an institution that behaved better towards its senior academics. She also vowed to take her revenge on Churchill College. Dirac and Mansi began making plans to settle in the USA. Some of its universities were certain to offer Dirac a professorship, and Mary and Monica, both married by the summer of 1968, now lived there. Mansi's brother, Eugene Wigner, was also in the USA and was one of the elder statesmen of American science, an advisor to the government and, to Mansi's irritation, moving politically further to the right each year. From his letters to the Diracs, it is plain that Wigner was a thoughtful and caring member of his family, but in the public eye, his humility had become something of an affectation. He was now so self-deprecating that many of its acquaintances thought he was using it as a subtle form of mockery. Ideally, the Diracs would have liked to have settled in Princeton, but that was no longer an option after Oppenheimer's retirement in June '66, 7 months before he died of throat cancer. The Institute for Advanced Study was unlikely to offer Dirac an academic home, nor could Princeton University be expected to accommodate a physicist so far past his best. Two branches of Dirac's family remained in Europe. Betty was a contented housewife in Amsterdam, doing chores to the soundtrack of the BBC Home Service, now Radio 4, and going regularly to the highest Catholic Mass she could find. In 1965, Gabriel was appointed to the mathematics faculty at the University of Swansea, soon after the US government rejected his application for a visa, apparently because of his brief membership of the Communist Party in Cambridge. 2 years later, he and his family moved to the University of Aarhus in Denmark, and Dirac and Mansi visited them during their summer vacations. Of all their children, Dirac and Mansi were most concerned about Judy, who had lost custody of her children after an acrimonious divorce in 1965. Soon afterwards, she moved to Vermont and spent several lonely months each year in the Wigners' summer cottage on the shore of Lake Elmore. Wigner feared for her mental health. He wrote to Mansi telling her that Judy was desperate for her mother's affection and pleading with her to support her troubled daughter. "You must not abandon her," he told Mansi in September 1965. 2.5 years later, Judy was holed up in a motel near Lake Elmore, lonely, penniless, and delusional. She desperately needed psychiatric help, Wigner believed, and he begged his sister to intervene. But Mansi told him that she would have nothing to do with Judy until she got a job, and that he should stop interfering. Mansi felt no responsibility for her daughter's plight, she wrote to Wigner. "Why should I, in the name of heaven, feel guilty? I did my duty, and who can throw a stone at me? Jay is an expert in hurting deeply, and maybe she does this to those she loves. In that case, she must seek a remedy." Mansi's indignation was suddenly punctured on the 17th of September 1968, when she read a telegram from her brother. "Judy's car found abandoned. Do you know whereabouts, love?" This was the worst day of Mansi's life, she later said. Mansi had no idea where Judy was. They were no longer in touch. In the following days, the Diracs heard nothing from Vermont or from the Wigners. Mansi was distraught, lurching between wildly different accounts of Judy's disappearance, always refusing to believe that her depression had led her to take her life. It was most likely, Mansi believed, that Judy had been murdered. Dirac's reactions to all of this were known only to Mansi, who appears to have shared them with no one. The Diracs decided not to travel to Vermont, but to stay in Britain and monitor events from there. They left it to the Vigners to deal with the authorities in Vermont. In early October, after visiting the site where Judy's car was found, a country lane near Morrisville, Vermont, Vigner and his wife wrote to the Diracs with details of the police hunt for her in the surrounding countryside and ponds. The search parties found nothing. Gradually, the Vigners, tearful and depressed, came to believe that Judy would never be seen again, but the Diracs clung to every last hope. For 3 years they tried to imagine scenarios in which Judy might suddenly reappear, but the weight of probability gradually crushed what remained of their optimism, and they accepted that it was practically certain that Judy was dead. Mary later recalled that her mother was inconsolable, insane with grief. The Diracs kept the pain of their loss private, but 2 of his later acquaintances, the sculptor Elaine Blumenfeld and her husband Yorick, the Newsweek journalist, glimpsed deeper feelings. The Bloomfelds recall that 2 years after Judy went missing, Dirac and Mancy were still losing sleep over her fate and talked about it endlessly. From Dirac's comments about her, the Blumenfelds assumed that he was her biological father. He was as sad and bereft as if he had lost his own daughter. In the early weeks of 1969, the Diracs were in Miami pondering life after Cambridge. Of the American universities wanting to employ Dirac, one of the most tempting offers had been made by his former student, Behram Kursanoglu, at the University of Miami. A wheeler-dealer Turkish theoretician, always smart in his Stetson hat, jacket and tie. Kursanoglu had spent his career searching for a unified theory of fundamental interactions, following Einstein's agenda. Kursanoglu had founded the annual Coral Gables conferences, which gave several leading theorists a good reason to leave their home cities in the depths of January and spend a few days in the bright, warm sun of southern Florida. Kursanoglu employed Dirac at the university on a temporary contract and tried hard to persuade him to accept a permanent post, making him and Mancy as welcome as family, taking them out on trips around the area and giving Dirac a taste for coconuts, alligators, and exotic birds. Mancy was embarrassed by the time Dirac took to weigh Kursanoglu's offer, but was not to be hurried. He disliked Miami's oppressive heat, and he felt uncomfortable in a place where recreational walkers are regarded as perverse. The most remarkable of Kursanoglu's outings was a trip to the cinema on New Year's Day. Kursanoglu and his wife asked Dirac to go with them to see Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey. The film had divided critics and audiences since its release 8 months before. It inspired Steven Spielberg and a new generation of filmmakers, but it left John Updike's Rabbit Angstrom bemused and sent his wife to sleep. Firmly on Spielberg's side, Dirac was enraptured. He had seen hundreds of movies, but he had never imagined it was possible for a film to have such a powerful impact and enable him to see his dreams as he told Mary's husband, Tony Coleraine. Dirac disliked opaque and open-ended narratives, so his love of 2001 was by no means predictable. It was easy, however, to imagine him being moved by Kubrick's use of Johann Strauss's Blue Danube and the rest of the classical soundtrack, and by the appeal of a story told mainly through visual images rather than words. Dirac's opinion that a good deal of quantum mechanics can be expressed accurately only through mathematics and not words is echoed by a comment Kubrick made about 2001. Kubrick said, "I don't like to talk about it much because it's essentially a non-verbal experience." Still excited 2 days later, Dirac saw the film again at a matinee with Tony Coleraine and also with Mancy and Mary, who spent most of the 2.5 hours in the theatre whispering to each other. Dirac suggested to Tony that they see it again without the running commentary. Without telling Mancy, they stayed to watch the next 2 screenings and returned home to find their hot dinner left to get cold on the table. But Dirac was too excited to care about food. He was like a child after 3 consecutive rides on a roller coaster. Several of the scenes had possessed him, especially the Stargate sequence and the emergence of the grizzled astronaut into the 18th century bedroom. "I would not have been able to sit alone through that scene," he later told Coleraine. Mancy was not interested in Dirac's observation on that weird film. Her idea of a good movie was the romantic episode Dr. Zhivago, not one whose most memorable character was a talking computer. 2001 stoked Dirac's interest in the Apollo space program. During the evening of 20th of July 1969, he sat open-mouthed in front of the television in the Kursonoglu's front room when Neil Armstrong prepared to set foot upon the moon. He sat up all night watching the coverage. Kubrick's images were sharper and his soundtrack was clearer, but the grainy television pictures and the muffled sound of that first moon landing had a compelling reality of their own. And for Dirac, the former engineer, reality mattered most. The first moonwalk was the culmination of aeronautic technology whose beginnings he had seen as a boy in Bristol, and which now enabled human beings to set foot upon a landscape 250,000 miles away. The Apollo team, having achieved the most impressive technological feat Dirac had seen in his lifetime, may well have given him a twinge of regret that he had chosen science rather than engineering. He had been a leader in a scientific revolution that, in his opinion, had led to a dead end, whereas the Apollo engineers could declare mission accomplished and move on. In the summer of 1969, Dirac prepared to leave his post and say his goodbyes to the few friends left in Cambridge, including Charlie Broad, the philosopher, who gave him his first proper introduction to the theory of relativity. Broad, aged 81, still lived in Trinity College, where he died 2 years later. On Tuesday the 30th of September, Dirac spent his final day in Cambridge as its Lucasian professor, the most distinguished holder of the chair since Sir Isaac Newton. Dirac's retirement passed without ceremony, presumably because the university's authorities assumed that Dirac would feel uncomfortable if he was the cynosure of a leaving party. This was an error, though an understandable one. Dirac would have liked his contribution to the university to have been marked officially, as his sense of propriety was, contrary to the impression he gave, stronger than his aversion to ceremony. Mansi was disgusted. She said she was gratified, but she was gratified by the sensitivity of St. John's College, which extended Dirac's fellowship for life, so that he could return there whenever he wished. Batchelor wanted to be generous too, and offered Dirac the use of a room in the department whenever he was passing through the town, but he declined. His true home in the university was his college, and not the department. For 2 years, the Diracs divided their time between the UK and the United States, and by March 1971, Mansi could hardly wait another day to leave Britain. That lazy, impossible island, she called it. Labour unrest, steadily increasing since the war, had become critical in the first year of Edward Heath's government. More working days had been lost to withdrawals of labour than in any year since the general strike. Postal workers had gone on strike and slowed down communications in the country for 7 weeks. Even Rolls-Royce had gone bankrupt. The Diracs were about to move to a country that was no less troubled. The USA's prosecution of the war in Vietnam was as controversial in the extended Wigner family as it was in thousands of others. The dovish Mansi seethed over young American lives mutilated fighting for a bastard government, and argued with her hawkish brother, Eugene, who believed that the war was essential to stem the spread of communism. She did not know that the FBI had opened a file on her and was seeking evidence that she was a subversive. Dirac knew that his past political sympathies would raise eyebrows in some American institutions, as he noted when he declined an invitation to the University of Texas at Austin because he was technically ineligible. I do not have strong political views, but I am a member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and this makes me, according to the university's definition, a member of the Communist Party. Whenever he left the USA in the late 1960s and 70s, he was nervous that the authorities might forbid him to re-enter it, as he probably suspected the FBI was still watching him. Dirac, a dissenter from America's foreign policy in Southeast Asia, followed the fierce opposition to the war in American universities through the newspapers and the television shows. Although Miami University was one of the less volatile campuses, its students harassed the authorities almost every day, condemning the Vietnam War, demanding free contraception, and more support for civil rights. The protesters would talk only to the university's president, Henry King Stanford, who stood on The Rock, a stage-like stone structure in the center of campus, making conciliatory speeches to the students and trying to avoid further trouble. On the periphery of these crowds, Stanfords often saw the slender, inquisitive figure of Dirac. On Wednesday, 6th of May 1971, the students were especially angry. It was 2 days after the Ohio State Guard had opened fire on student demonstrators at Kent State University during a protest triggered by the American invasion of Cambodia. 13 seconds of gunfire had killed 4 students, wounded 9 others, and brutally curtailed the flower power hedonism that had flourished only briefly since the Sgt. Pepper Summer of Love in 1967. The mood of America turned ugly. Even the usually sober campuses of Princeton University were unstable. Wigner thought many of the students were selfish and nihilistic, behaving like Hitler Youth. Miami University teetered on the edge of anarchy when its students, supported by many staff, began a 4-day strike, joining 250 other campuses across the country. After lunch, at the beginning of a warm afternoon, Stanford made his way to the Rock to address the volatile rally of over 1,000 students, many of them with their arms folded aggressively or holding banners with messages such as US dollars out of Southeast Asia. Earlier, the crowd had made an effigy of President Nixon out of newspapers, old clothes, and firecrackers, and they set fire to it. Dirac had seen nothing remotely like it since the Cambridge demonstrations in the 1930s. During Stanford's walk around the crowd, he saw an elderly man on the periphery and was quite taken aback to be approached by him. It was, of course, Dirac, who asked gently, "Are you afraid?" Stanford, his heart pumping hard in his chest, replied, his tongue firmly in his cheek, that he was quite looking forward to addressing the students. It seems that Dirac saw that the president was anxious and could use a little reassurance, as he took what was for him the unusual step of offering him advice. Tell them what you think and listen to what they have to say. The tone of Dirac's voice gave the impression that he had a spiritual kinship with the protesters, as Stanford later wrote, perhaps identifying a faint echo from the days when Dirac was on the fringe of left-of-centre radicalism. In his emollient address, Stanford described the Kent State incident as one of the saddest chapters in the history of higher education, adding that the students' deaths dramatized the deterioration of reason in the USA. Shortly after the speech, the protest ended peaceably, though the university remained on edge for weeks. Dirac probably wondered what future lay ahead of him. A few weeks later, the Diracs took a break and drove up to Florida's state capital of Tallahassee. Compared with the tense, crime-ridden Miami, it was as friendly and as safe as a village. Dirac knew that he was being wooed by Florida State, known best not for its physics department, but for its student parties and the high quality of its football team. Joe Lanuti, the physics department's ambitious leader, saw an opportunity to persuade the dithering Dirac to become a professor at large at the university, a mascot for the physics department's aspiration to be a centre of excellence. Lanuti had already invited the Diracs to Tallahassee in March 1969, when the Holiday Inn welcomed them with banners fluttering over the entrance, and the physics department had given tenure to Mary's husband Tony a few months later. For the Diracs, the prospect of spending their final years near Mary was attractive, and the warm climate would be good for the worsening arthritis in Mancy's hands. But Dirac wanted to delay his decision until he could see how he coped with the fiercest of Tallahassee's heat and humidity, and with the barking dogs that ruined his walks. Swimming was now his favourite form of exercise, So, in his spare hours, he visited the local lakes and sinkholes, usually taking a thermometer to check the temperature of the water. If it was above precisely 60 degrees Fahrenheit, he would dive in. If not, he would return home. In early January 1971, Florida State University formally offered Dirac the post of visiting eminent professor, to be renewed annually. The FBI had found no evidence that either Mansi nor Dirac was a subversive, so there was to be no official barrier to their emigration. After reflecting on the offer for 5 months, Dirac accepted and shortly afterwards returned briefly to Cambridge with Mansi to pack up their belongings. During one of their conversations with the Bloomfelds, Helene asked Dirac whether he was excited about moving to Tallahassee, and he replied, gesturing to Mansi, "She is. That's why we're going. I would like to stay here."